As mentioned, adolescent sexual health is an international global controversy. And if we look at the very poor countries, there is often a need to marry off girls in order to secure their future. On the other hand, they are then depriving their daughters of schooling and of education. So that is one of the reasons it is a big controversy. And we also know that the pregnancy, an early pregnancy of a, let's say, 13, 14-year-old girl has a much higher risk than a later, just a few years later, pregnancy. So there are huge campaigns now in order to postpone marriage, because when a girl is married off, it's very often expected that she becomes pregnant and that she delivers a child. And if we look at the number of girls that are married off and I say married off because very often it's not their own wish, but it's that of their parents or their guardians. And if we look at the number of girls that are married off before the age of 18, it's a massive number. It's 650 million. And look at the different geographical groups. Because of the huge populations in South Asia, it's a high number, and also early marriage is quite common. There are now big campaigns. The UN is working a lot to postpone marriage and then to secure the education of girls. There's a lot of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, that are working on this. And there is a huge campaign called Girls Not Brides. So there seems to be some improvement in the attitudes, but then, of course, the problem with poverty is there. And if the parents feel that they can either have an extra mouth to feed, or they can marry off a girl and she can do some work in another family and she can have a child maybe and be accepted, and then they are rid of their own problems. So the link to poverty is very clear. And at the same time, it is seen as extremely important to postpone marriage for girls. UNICEF is of course it's the Children's Fund of the UN, and they are doing a lot of work specifically on this, and also governments and NGOs, as I mentioned. If we look at an extreme case, Iran, it also reflects the fact that you can have a legal age of marriage, but it's not necessarily abided by. The legal age of marriage in Iran is 13 years for girls and 15 for boys, but with parental consent it can be earlier. And from March 2017 to March 2018, 217 girls under the age of 10 were married off, and then a big number between 10 and 14, and also a big number between 15 and 19. So it is a reflection of the fact that a country can have a legal age of marriage, but there can be exceptions, either then by parental consent or people simply break the law. Again, it's a desperate symptom of poverty, but it does have a major reflection on the sexual health and reproductive health of young girls. To a greater extent than for boys, the girls' and women's sexuality is a basis for family honor, for economic trade. In some countries you have dowry, which means there's money going from the girl's family to the boy's family, and in many countries in Africa you have bride price, where money goes in the opposite direction. The problem is that whether it goes in one or the other way, it's often the girls that pull the shortest straw in this, because they become a commodity that is either sold or bought, and then with some obligations in terms of expectations, for instance, to have a baby. And also girls' and women's sexuality and reproduction is a theme for ethic and religious decisions to a larger degree than boys. And again, we can see that also in our own history. Not so many decades ago, the blame was always put on the girl if there was a problem. If there was a child born out of wedlock, for instance, it was a bad reflection on the girl, but not on the boy. And we see very similar things in the rest of the world today. So there are some similar trends, but the history is different, and the world is also evolving on this. But I think it can give a deeper understanding if we look a little bit back in our own history, and look at the status of women related to their sexual and reproductive activities. In global negotiations, the two most contentious issues are, as I mentioned, abortion and adolescent sexuality. And the issue with adolescent sexuality is then twofold. One is the moral discussion, the ethical discussion, and the other is the economic discussion. And in these debates, in the global debates, then the developing countries, or I hate the term developing countries, but the low-income countries, they often said, if we can get more development assistance, we can raise our children to become mature without having to marry girls off. And this becomes a very sore tension between low and middle income countries on one side and high income countries on the other side. And it complicates the discussions a lot, but I think it's important to see it in this context. The solutions that were found in the ICPD, the International Conference on Population and Development, that was held in 1994 in Cairo, which was really a landslide change, where when the focus was changed from population control with massive emphasis on family planning in a very narrow way, and distribution of contraceptives in this thought that in the hope that would curb the so-called population bomb, the population explosion that it was called, and then shifted to care for sexual and reproductive health. But the notion of population bomb can still come back, so I think we should be aware of that. The interesting thing is that despite the shift to a wider perspective, the fertility has been gradually going down. So it's actually more conducive also for fertility reduction to have a wider perspective and look at sexual and reproductive health as a whole. Abortion, there was a consensus in the Cairo conference on abortion, and that consensus still stands. There was a whole paragraph on abortion, very carefully crafted. I was in that little group, and we were negotiating through nights, and it was quite dramatic. And we got an agreement which still stands, which means that when in the UN, every time the abortion issue is coming up, they just glue in that whole paragraph, again showing that the Cairo conference was really groundbreaking, but also the sad thing that we haven't progressed since 1994 on this. Then if we look at the fertility pattern, from 1990, I will give you a lot of figures, but I hope that you can see the big picture. For the world as a whole, it has gone down from 3.2 to 2.5 from 1990 to 2019. Sub-Saharan Africa is the part of the world with the highest fertility, but there also it has gone down from 6.3 to 4.6 during those almost 20 years. And in Eastern and Southern Asia, it was already low in 1990, but it's gone down further. So we see there is still a dramatic decrease in fertility, which also shows that a bigger perspective on reproductive health instead of just narrowing in, zooming in on contraceptives has really worked. And if we look at contraceptive access and use, then there has been a change from 1990 to 2019 with an increase in modern methods, but still it's less than 50%. And traditional methods have gone down. That's been different kinds of herbs, either to ingest or to put in the vagina of the woman. And long-acting permanent methods are more effective in averting pregnancy than others. On the other hand, during the time when there was a narrow focus on family planning, on contraceptives, then the long-acting and permanent methods, which are very much providers decided, they got a bad reputation because there was a push, and many women were pushed to using IUDs, or being sterilized without their will. So, but now the long-acting methods that are provided, steered, they have become more popular. But there was a period of time when they were really quite unpopular, and one wanted women to be able to steer their use of contraceptives themselves, and then of course pills were very popular. There's still a huge unmet need for contraceptives, more than 200 million women and couples. And the reasons is that some don't have any access, or they don't have confidence in contraceptives, and then the bad reputation from previous time, or it's too expensive. And this leads to more than 100 million unintended pregnancies. The exact number is debated, but this is one source, and Guttmacher is a very good global source, and more than 35 million unsafe abortions, which is a threat to women's health, and I will come back to the unsafe abortions in a later session.